Welcome back to part 2 of the Flying Monkeys. Let's get started. Howard Lutnick isn't a flying monkey. He's a vessel. As Secretary of Commerce, Lutnick brings a long career in high finance, one defined by aggressive deal-making, risk tolerance, and an instinct for survival above all else. His public identity has been shaped by tragedy. The loss of employees and family members in the 9/11 attacks became central to his media presence, for years spilling his crocodile tears. What followed, however, was not retreat, but expansion. Lutnick rebuilt his firm aggressively, navigating catastrophe into renewed wealth and influence. To some, that was resilience. To others, it raised uncomfortable questions about how he grifted off tragedy in pursuit of power. What is clear is that Lutnick's moral framework is transactional. He holds a degree in economics. He understands markets. He understands trade, which makes his role in promoting misleading narratives about tariffs deeply troubling. Tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. They are passed on to consumers, businesses, and supply chains. Lutnick knows this, and yet he repeatedly presents tariff policy as consequence-free patriotism. That is not ignorance, it is deception. His involvement in trade discussions affecting Canada places real economic pressure on cross-border commerce, while his family continues to benefit from the risk these policies create. When personal finance interests align neatly with national policy chaos, scrutiny is not optional, it's necessary. Lutnick has publicly expressed disdain toward Canada, framing trade not as partnership, but as dominance. That posture is not commerce, it's exploitation. Lutnick is not someone who should be trusted with economic stewardship. Because when profit becomes the primary compass, devastation is just another market condition. You may have heard me refer to him as Nutlick, a fitting nickname for someone who spends so much time on his knees groveling. And then we have Little Moses Mike. Some monkeys scream, some spin, Mike Johnson chatters. As Speaker of the House, Johnson's job is to ensure fair proceedings that protect the institution of Congress. Instead, he has turned the gavel into a shield for one man. Johnson has repeatedly used procedural power not to govern, but to delay, obstruct, and deflect scrutiny away from the leader whenever uncomfortable questions arise. The House has been brought to a standstill more than once, not in service of legislation, but in service of protection. That's not leadership, that's control damage. Johnson presents himself as a deeply devout Christian, a moral authority, a defender of the family values. Those beliefs inform his opposition to reproductive rights, LGBTQ equality, and immigration. Yet what's most striking isn't his faith, it's how selectively it's applied. Mercy is absent. Accountability is optional. Power is protected at all costs. Johnson does not act independently, he reacts. He repeats narratives, he blocks inquiries, he advances talking points that collapse under scrutiny. That makes him a perfect puppet. Not because he lacks intelligence, but because he lacks resistance. His version of faith demands obedience, not integrity, submission, not truth. And when religious language is used to excuse the abuse of power, it becomes a weapon rather than a guide. Johnson poses no direct threat to Canada, but as Speaker of the House, his willingness to paralyze democratic process in service of one individual weakens the very institutions that allies rely on. He doesn't lead the house, he guards the door. And history is never kind to men who mistake obedience for righteousness. Some people should never be anywhere near the machinery of war. Pete Hegseth is one of them. As Secretary of Defense, or as they like to call it, Secretary of War, Hegseth now sits at the intersection of military power, global stability, and life and death decision making. What we're seeing so far is not discipline, it's recklessness. Hegseth has a documented history of inflammatory rhetoric, extreme ideological framing, and a casual posture towards violence that treats war not as a last resort, but as a proving ground. He speaks about conflict with enthusiasm rather than restraint. That alone should concern everyone. Hegseth did serve in the National Guard and received commendations for his service. That experience deserves acknowledgement. But military service does not automatically qualify someone to lead the world's most powerful armed forces, especially when their public careers shifted not into strategic command, diplomacy, or defense planning, but into cable news performance. Governing is not broadcasting. War is not commentary. Hegseth's past public statements have aligned with nationalist and exclusionary worldviews that flatten complex global realities into simplistic us versus them narratives. That mindset is profoundly dangerous at this level. The role of Secretary of Defense demands restraint, government, judgment, and respect for civilian life. What Hegseth projects instead is bravado, certainty without reflection, aggression without accountability. This isn't about personal conduct or rumor, it's about fitness. When someone tasked with preventing war appears eager for confrontation, the risk is not hypothetical, it's global. Pete Hegseth doesn't just pose a danger to the United States, he poses a danger to stability itself. Because the most dangerous people in power aren't the ones who lose control, they are the ones who never believed control was necessary. And may I just mention, there have been reports of alcoholism. If true, he should not be in this position. Allegations of sexual assault. Again, if true, he should not be in this position. And let's not forget about Singlegate. What do you think? Should he have been fired at that point? Voldemort. Because he is pure evil, and just look at him. Every barrel of flying monkeys has one figure who isn't loud, isn't visible, and isn't interested in applause. Stephen Miller is that figure. As Deputy Chief of Staff, Miller's role isn't ceremonial, it's operational. He designs policy, shapes messaging, and drives enforcement priorities. And his focus has been singular: deportation as punishment. Over multiple administrations, Miller has been the constant force behind policies that empathize detention, separation, and suffering as deterrents, not as side effects, as strategy. He does not speak in the language of governance. He speaks in the language of removal. People become numbers, families become logistics, human beings become problems to be contained. Detention is framed as necessity. Cruelty is framed as strength. This isn't accidental, and it isn't emotional. It's ideological. Miller has repeatedly pushed narratives that dehumanize migrants and asylum seekers, portraying them as invaders, criminals, and threats regardless of evidence. He spreads propaganda relentlessly, seeding talking points that are then echoed by press secretaries, lawmakers, and media allies. This is how policy laundering works. And while others perform outrage and incompetence, Miller operates quietly, refining, reinforcing, and escalating. Many observers believe Miller wields more influence over domestic policy than his title suggests. Not because he seeks attention, but because he supplies something the leader values above all else: certainty without compassion. Miller poses no direct threat to Canada, but his worldview matters to everyone. Because when a government normalizes suffering as governance, it doesn't stop at one group. Cruelty is never contained, it metastasizes. And history shows us that systems built on dehumanization eventually consume far more than they were designed to. This man's own grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and here he is, locking people away in what are almost the same as concentration camps. Where is his moral compass? If you are still here monkeying around, then please hit the like and subscribe if you haven't already. Your interaction with the channel helps out so much and is so appreciated. So what do you think so far? Let me know in the comments. Make sure you watch part 1 of this series, and part 3 is on its way. There are appointments that feel reckless, and then there are appointments that feel actively dangerous. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services is the latter. Known as the Pied Piper, he comes from one of the most respected political families in American history and has spent decades dismantling the trust that name once represented, mainly by a life of being a drunk, a heroin user, a playboy, allegedly, and his ridiculous conspiracy theories. Kennedy's influence has never come from medical training, public health expertise, or scientific research. It has come from his last name, and from his ability to speak confidently while rejecting science. For years, Kennedy has been one of the most prominent voices promoting vaccine misinformation, repeatedly questioning their safety despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. His claims have been rejected by medical professionals, public health institutions, and scientific bodies across the world. This isn't healthy skepticism, it's ideologically an opposition to evidence. As Secretary of Health and Human Services, that worldview is no longer theoretical. HHS oversees vaccine programs, disease prevention, health guidance, and emergency response. These systems rely on public trust. Undermine that trust and people die. Not metaphorically, literally. History has already shown what happens when vaccine confidence collapses. Preventable diseases return, hospitals overflow, and the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, and the compromised, pay the price. Kennedy's elevation signals that expertise no longer matters, only narrative. He is not a threat because he is loud or chaotic. He's a threat because he presents misinformation in the language of concern, freedom, and parental protection, drawing people away from evidence while insisting he is their guide. He is the Pied Piper, because when authority figures lead people away from science, the consequences don't stop with belief. They end in graves. This one raises a very basic question. How does someone go from being a podcaster to the director of the FBI? Kash Patel does have a background in law and national security. He worked as a public defender, a federal prosecutor, and later held national security roles during Trump's first term. But it was during that first term that Patel became best known not for independence or institutional leadership, but for unwavering loyalty to one man. Patel was a central figure in efforts to discredit investigations into Trump and his inner circle, repeatedly attacking the FBI, the intelligence community, and the Justice Department from the inside and the outside. After leaving government, he pivoted to podcasts and public appearances where he amplified claims of a deep state and called for purges within federal law enforcement agencies. He was especially vocal about demanding the release of the Epstein files, framing himself as a transparency crusader. Now, as director of the FBI, that transparency has gone silent. Instead, Patel oversees the very institution he once accused of corruption while being tasked with protecting investigations that may touch the same political figures as he publicly defended for years. That is not reform, that is capture. Patel's appointment signals a shift in the FBI's role, from an independent law enforcement agency to one expected to align with political loyalty. Critics have raised serious concerns about his personal use of government resources, the politicalization of investigations, and the erosion of institutional norms under his leadership. Even more troubling is his rhetoric towards allies. Patel has publicly accused Canada of enabling large-scale drug trafficking across the border, claims that experts and officials have repeatedly disputed. This kind of language matters. The FBI director is not a pundit. He is not a cultural war influencer. He is entrusted with protecting the rule of law without fear, favor, or allegiance. When that role is filled with someone whose public identity has been built on loyalty and grievance, the danger isn't chaos, it's selective justice. And once law enforcement becomes selective, democracy becomes optional. If there's one appointment that should make people pay attention, it's this one. Tom Homan is a member of the Heritage Foundation and one of the architects behind Project 2025. I have a video coming out about Project 2025. Watch for it. As border czar, Homan presents himself as a law and order figure, repeatedly claiming that enforcement efforts target only the worst of the worst violent criminals who entered the country illegally. But that data, court findings, and reporting tell a different story. Under policies he supports, families are separated, asylum seekers are detained, and long-term residents with no violent history are swept into enforcement actions. This is not precision enforcement. It is mass enforcement. Pullman has consistently framed immigration as an existential threat, using language designed to stoke fear rather than explain reality. The rhetoric has consequences. When enforcement policy is driven by propaganda instead of proportionality, civil rights become collateral damage. Communities are left afraid to report crimes. Legal residents are questioned based on appearance, and due process becomes optional. This is not about border security. It's about expanding state power through fear. Critics warn that under Pullman's vision, immigration enforcement ceases to be a regulatory function and becomes a tool of social control. The danger isn't just to undocumented migrants, it's to the legal framework that protects everyone. When a government normalizes sweeping enforcement without individualization accountability, it doesn't strengthen the nation, it weakens it. This isn't a SAR guarding the border, it's an enforcer testing how far the system can be pushed. Is it surprising that this president would rely on a convicted felon as an advisor? Not really. Birds of a feather flock together, as they say. Steve Bannon served as a senior advisor during Trump's first term, and despite legal troubles and public disgrace, remains deeply influential in far-right political circles. Bannon isn't loyal to Trump so much as he's loyal to the ideology, one rooted in authoritarian nationalism, culture war politics, and permanent grievance. He has long aligned himself with organizations and thinkers connected to the Heritage Foundation and similar power centers that operate behind the scenes, shaping policy through media influence rather than elective office. Bannon's real power has never been governance. It's narrative. Through podcasts, speeches, and alternative media networks, he pushes whatever story best fuels outrage, division, and distrust, regardless of facts. Today's enemy might be immigrants. Tomorrow's might be journalists. The next day, it's the justice system itself. Consistency doesn't matter. Conflict does. Bannon has openly promoted the idea of tearing down democratic institutions from within, describing it as flooding the zone, overwhelming the public with so much misinformation and chaos that truth becomes impossible to identify. That's not political strategy. That's psychological warfare. His proximity to powerful and controversial figures has been well documented, yet he has never been held accountable for the damage caused by the movements he amplifies. Bannon doesn't need an official title to be dangerous. His influence operates in the background where accountability is weakest and propaganda spreads fastest. This isn't an advisor offering counsel, it's a professional agitator ensuring the outrage machine that never shuts down. There are still a few more monkeys to look at, so come on back for part 3, our final look at the flying monkeys and their leader. Until then, stay groovy, peace and love,